Perfect. Yeah, I have another client. It's kind of ISA that I couldn't really. It was like about 90, so I couldn't really say like is he narrow, is he wide. But like I went through the assessment with him, and it was basically his major concern was right SI pain, and basically his he couldn't expand his I did the PRI apical chest wall expansion. He couldn't expand his right chest wall, and so his single leg raise was about 70 degrees on both, and his hip flexion was 90 degrees on the left and about 105 on the right. And what really got me like thinking was his shoulder internal rotation was about 80 degrees on both sides. So there I was like, I don't know who I'm dealing with. And his his shoulder flexion was about 65 on both, but it was more limited on the right, on the left, sorry, which is normal if he can expand his left apical more. So his left shoulder would be shoulder flexion would be more limited, right? And
Uh, Certain ranges, because you do have ER and IR contributions.
and his FAIR was like very poor. It was like 10 degrees. Yeah. And ER was, yeah, around 40, something like that.
Okay,
Plus,
gotcha.
his left shoulder external rotation was slightly limited. So I did a hook lying with him, and I I was thinking he's a narrow with some secondary compensation in the shoulder, especially the left one. So I put him in a hook lying, and I made him reach towards his knees. So it was like low reach. And that really cleared up his FAER and his single leg raise and his hip flexion.
Nice.
But
Nice.
I would like to know how would you progress his treatment, and what would you focus on? Would that be more his pain, or would you want to see some improvements in any other assessment measures? I just want to hear your thoughts on that.
Yeah. So this person definitely sounds, based on the limitations, like they are narrow. When you have someone who's kind of in the middle, that's usually a telltale sign that there are secondary compensations, or they're having progressively more and more compression. Because if I'm really narrow, I should be good at closing but not opening. If I'm really wide, I should be good at opening and not closing, the lower rib cage, that is. So if you got someone who's kind of, it does this and it's approaching midline, that's because they're getting progressively more squish. But instead of looking at specific degrees, here's what I would consider doing for someone in the mid zone instead. Is if you look at the shape of it, are the angles closer to vertical or are they closer to horizontal?
I think he was closer to horizontal.
So then that would be someone who's a wide. Because if it's more like this, then that's a wide ISA. But if you notice it's kind of approaching this, then you're looking at a narrow.
It was a kind of person who I went in with my fingers, and it's like it's the same with myself. I'm narrow, but when I went in, his xiphoid process is like pointing out, you don't have, yeah, you don't have a nice angle at the ISA, but it's it's like an angle, and then it's like xiphoid process coming into your both thumbs. If you go upward, you like, yeah,
So, I'm sorry. I would not use the xiphoid as your marker to measure the ISA for that reason. I ran into some people, especially, you'll run into some people who have trauma at the xiphoid. Like I had a guy at one of my seminars where his xiphoid was like turned out to the side. So right then and there, it's like, okay, that's an unreliable marking point. So what I would do instead is go just below the xiphoid, but not too low that you're measuring the inferior thoracic aperture. So you kind of want, because if you go too low, everyone's going to be wide. Also, though, if you go too high up, everyone's going to be narrow because that's just the contour of the rib cage. So you kind of want to be in the middle of the thorax. So that would be one thing. Okay? Now, another trick you can use, and I got this from Greg Hawthorne, he's a really sharp guy. If you're unsure, what you can do is you can measure the distance between the bottom of the ribs and the top of the iliac crest. So it would be here. So and just put like a couple fingers there. If you got someone who you can maybe only put one or two fingers there, that's a narrow ISA because the rib cage is much longer. If you got someone where you can put 3 or 4, then you're likely dealing with a wide ISA. And if you think about it, it makes sense because if I'm wide, the rib cage is going to be more in that bucket handle up position at the lower. So there should be a greater distance between the lower part of the rib cage and the top of the iliac crest. Versus with the narrow, you got an exhaled orientation. The rib cage is going to be more down and in, so that space should be reduced. So I would check that. But then to what you went after, I think is totally appropriate because it goes into the concept of filling the water bottle bottom up. So if you know you'll need IRs at some point, you have to get the ERs first, right? So him having a loss of external rotation, well, in order for me to get to, let's say 90, 100 degrees of hip flexion, which is maximal IR, I have to be able to get the ER portion of hip flexion first. So too with shoulder flexion. So I thought your first move was spot on. Now, Ian, what I want you to think about, and maybe this is where you got to go next, is you notice some asymmetries. So think about those asymmetries. What were the big noticeable ones? You said something in the shoulder and maybe something in the hip.
Yeah, his shoulder flexion was limited on the left, and his HG, his shoulder external rotation was slightly limited on the left as well. And yeah, that's basically, and his hip flexion was limited on the left as well.
Okay, so with those 3 measures in mind, if I have a loss of external rotation on the left, what direction is the spine going to be turning?
Loss of external rotation on the left, would it be towards the left?
Well, so think about this. If I had ER, or if I turn my spine to the left, ready? The spinous processes right here are going to move away from the left. You see that? So in order for that to happen, what has to happen to tissues and like muscles on the left back side of that person?
All right, yeah, so they would eccentrically orient.
Correct. Yep. And so if they could eccentrically orient, you should have the ability to externally rotate. So given that he does not have the ability to externally rotate,
His spine's toward the right, yeah.
you got it. So he's pushing forward, which is why you're getting some IR loss, and then he's turning to the right, which is why you got the ER loss.
Yeah.
So after you've gotten the stack and you've restored some ER measures, what do you think your next move is?
to go after ER on the left
Yes. And how could you do that?
with low reaching,
That's one option. What else could you do?
maybe like for the hip, like staggered stance.
I like where you're going. If you staggered stance, where would you be putting weight? What leg would be in front first?
It would be if we need, uh, yeah, you would want to hip shift into the right hip, so you would have a you would do internal rotation on the right and external on the left. So you would probably go right foot forward, left foot back.
So, if you did left foot forward and right foot back, and I'm assuming you're talking,
Or I could do the exercise like we did, the standing squat, where you hold the bar, but I would put like right foot back, left foot forward. Would that go with the ISO squat hold?
so that could work if two things. If you're trying to get ERs back, you got to put your weight on the front leg. And then, in that position, Ian, so you're not in much hip flexion. You're probably, 20 to 30 degrees. So what is going to be the relative sacral positioning when I'm in that amount of hip flexion?
To the left.
It will be to the left, but will it be counter-nutated or nutated?
It would be counter-nutated.
Exactly. So you're counter-nutated in that position, and then you got a little bit of initially turning to the left. So if I want to get ER on this side, the left side, which direction would I shift?
Away from the left.
Not necessarily. No. Because when I do a shift at higher depths of hip flexion, if I want to increase ER, it is. So I'm going to drive further sacral turn by shifting towards the leg.
All right. But you have to stay from 0 to 60 of hip flexion, right?
Correct. If you did the same shift, now where you would be right in shifting away is if I was at 90 degrees, because then, now what's going on with the sacrum? Talk me through it, Ian. You're getting it.
Yeah, it will start nutating, and
Boom.
yeah, and the innominate on the right would come forward into flexion, right? If I would rotate away. Yeah.
You do that. Yeah.
Too much of hip flexion on the right, yeah.
Yeah. So if you shifted away, you would get more external rotation on this left side.
All right. Makes sense.
Yep. So, and the key with shifting is when you do that, you're getting this person, generally, the goal, to turn more left. So that could be another treatment as well, is just do anything you can think of that drives rotation to the left, assuming you got the stack.
Plus from 0 to 60 hip flexion or shoulder flexion, right? So yeah.
Well, you could, or, what you could do, you could work 90 degrees and reach with the right arm. That's going to get a left turn. There's a move on my YouTube channel. I can't remember if this was the one I gave you, the offset squat, but I got left arm is 0 to 60. All right, what you do with that particular move is I got the 0 to 60 position. I'm getting a little bit of a forward reach, so I create some eccentric orientation on the left. And then when I reach the right arm forward, because I'm turning the spine to the left, I get even more eccentric orientation on that left side, which can help restore the ERs. And then, if you go left foot back, right foot forward, that's going to drive that turn even further. But it would be more of a late stance position as opposed to early stance, which is what you were talking about with your stagger stance, where the weight's more left front.
Left front, yeah. All right.
So that would be where I would likely be thinking with this person, assuming that they got a dynamic ISA and all that. Like, I still think you need to milk that first and foremost.
Yeah, for sure. For sure. We have to get him to stock first, to talk first, and yeah, we'll go on from there.
Awesome. And then I would double check that, do the side measure on the ISA because that will confirm your suspicions of what way to go.